Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started. Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion with Josh Dean about pride and the power of parables. So in part 1 we saw that biblically pride is presented as this deep-rooted thing in humanity that pushes back against God. Right from the beginning, it was seen in the choices and the motivation of Adam and Eve in the garden, and they're presented almost as archetypes of all human beings. So as the Bible story unfolds, we see even the good guys like Moses prone to pride. So now in part 2, Josh is going to take us through a parable which illustrates the power of stories as a teaching method for this kind of thing, and in particular how it relates to this issue of pride. So here we go with part 2 of Pride and the Power of Parables. Right, we need to get into our parable and talk about how this parable helps us deal with this deep-rooted feature of human nature, if you like. So do you want to introduce the parable that we're going to look at?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. I suppose it's worth thinking about. This is one of the reasons that we see Jesus, I think, teaching in parables, and other great teachers teaching in parables as well. They're very useful in dealing with something that we often struggle to deal with head on. Yeah. If someone screams at you to calm down, you're probably not going to calm down. If someone says, hey, you're being proud and arrogant right now, you're probably not going to be able to turn that dial down with ease. And so the parable is, I think, trying to aim at actually effectively dealing with that. And the parable of these three main characters in Luke chapter 15, you would often have heard it referred to probably as the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the lost son, or the lost sons. And it's a fascinating and wonderful parable that's, I think, being told in part to challenge those who, due to their pride, are seeing some people around them as not worthy or beyond forgiveness. And so the parable is told to challenge pride in people's perception about that fact and about other things as well.
Okay, how do you want us to work through this then?
So I think what we'll do
Luke 15, verse 11, isn't it?
Yes, Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through to the end, through to verse 32. I think what we'll do is we'll focus on the three main characters in the sort of the three main acts of the parable. First, you have the character of the younger son and his behaviour, what he goes and does. We secondly have the character of the father, we'll sort of look at his compassion and his reaction to his younger son, and then we have the character of the older brother and his reaction to the younger son and the father. So let's take the younger son section first. And so we'll begin reading at verse 11, and we'll read through basically until the father starts speaking to him
so up to verse 20 then.
Verse 20, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read that through.
Okay.
And then talk to us about it. So and he said, and Jesus said, this is verse 11. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him.
Okay. So a couple of things of context to help us understand what's happening here. If a son says to his father, Father, give me the share of property, give me my inheritance, give me what is coming to me, today it probably is still quite strange, but certainly property and inheritance is only dealt out at the death or right before the death of the father in a community, in a culture, in a context that Jesus is speaking in here in Luke chapter 15. So demanding the inheritance here and now at on the son's timescale is sort of tantamount to sort of wishing death early upon your father, that the money or the goods, possessions, the land, whatever it is going to be handed over. And we see here the son deciding that he wants things on his own time frame. He wants the inheritance now, and then what he gathers all of these things, and no doubt if they were flocks or lands or whatever, they've been converted to cash, so they're portable. So he's changing the family wealth and holdings to something that pleases him better, and then he leaves in order to go and enjoy his time elsewhere. He squanders his property in reckless living at the end of verse 13. So he's decided how he's going to use the good things that his father has given him. Just one small point: the reason we call this the parable of the prodigal son is because prodigal refers to the amount, the greatness with which of the sort of the loss, of the waste of all this money. Prodigal or prodigious means a great amount, rather than someone who sort of goes away and comes back again. Yes, which is often how you hear it referred to these days. So the son is acting pridefully in that he says, "Oh, well, I know better than my father. I want the money that's coming to me now. I don't want my father to have it. I also don't want it to be flocks or calves or whatever it might be. I want it in cold hard cash so that I can take it away and use it how I see fit." And then we see this imbalance sort of brought home incredibly challengingly to him. The famine arises. These greater forces that he is unable to deal with comes along, and he is in need, and so goes from high to low there in verse 14. He hires himself out so that he has to work. No longer is he able to party and enjoy himself with his father's riches. And he then, we see in verse 17, this sort of realization of the error of his ways, the prideful thinking that he has he's done, that has taken him to the place in which he finds himself. And verse 17, he comes to himself. When he came to himself, this realization that this imbalance in his thinking and in the goodness of his father changes his direction, and so he about faces, and we sort of see this sort of rehearsing in the mirror the words that he's going to say to his father at his return. He's going to humble himself. He's not even going to try and come back as a son. He says, "Well, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I'll just be a hired servant. I'll work in the house and I'll get room and board, and that'll be fine for me because I'm in such a dire straits and a terrible position that I am in here, out of the country." And so he rises and he tries to return to his father.
And as a hearer of this story, originally a Jewish audience, so being forced to feed pigs is like the ultimate lowest place that you could fall.
Absolutely.
But as a hero, you're kind of with this son, and you can see him acting foolishly, and you kind of know that you're watching a car crash about to happen.
Absolutely.
And you're sort of saying, "No, don't do it. Don't do it. It's not going to end well." And yet he does it.
It's a sort of a descent through loss, and he's losing his family because he's leaving it behind. He's losing his home because he's leaving that behind. He's losing all the money. He's losing any sort of state or sort of religious purity in any sort of sense because he's feeding these pigs. Even his friends seem to desert him. There's no one who's going to look after him, and no one gives him anything in the end of verse 16 there. So it's this incredible loss, despite we initially met him trying to accumulate all this wealth and take all the things that he wanted for himself.
So another example of pride comes before the fall.
Exactly.
And even if, without saying it directly, it's driving home the point that sort of attitude, behaviour often doesn't end well.
Exactly, and we're supposed to, I think, within the bounds of the parable, be sort of looking quite negatively towards this younger son. He's made an absolute mess. His father has been perhaps a bit reckless, or perhaps overkind in actually, giving the inheritance early. And certainly, when we see the kind of things that the younger son does with it, it seems like a terrible decision.
Yeah.
And so the first sort of hurt is compounded and made much worse by the incredible loss, the prodigious loss of all this of all these assets.
So he's had his change of heart. Are we ready to move into what comes next?
Let's look at the second section. Yes, let's think about the father.
Okay, so that's from verse 21 and through to the verse 24, I think. So here we go, verse 21. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this, my son, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate.
Okay, so we see the son sort of begin his rehearsed speech that we sort of heard him whilst he was still in this far country preparing. But before he can even complete the speech and sort of offer himself as a hired servant, the father seems to interrupt him. And instead of perhaps what the listeners might have expected, sort of turning the son around and booting him out as this wastrel, or condemning him as you're no son of mine, or something along those lines. Instead, the father acts incredibly mercifully and generously and compassionately. No expense is spared. The best robe is brought out. The servants of the house go and put it on him and put a ring on his hand. All these other things that are in the father's possession are offered to this son who has returned. The fatted calf is taken, and a huge party is put on. I had a bit of a look at to try and see how many people you would be expected in these days to feed with a fatted calf, and I got a variety of numbers, but some of the more conservative ones are around the sort of 60, 70 people mark. So it's a big party. Other people are being invited, and because this son who has lost all this money, who has brought shame and certainly some gossip or something like that on the father's household, because he's got off and he's wasted all the money and he was feeding pigs, and now he's come back and wants to be brought back. But instead the father does not stand on his pride and keep this son at a distance, or perhaps maybe let him in if he behaves himself as a hired servant. Instead, no, he is fully restored back to his position as part of the family, and welcomed with joyful tears and a hug and open arms.
But the son has learned a lot, you feel?
I think so, yes. And I think also, yes, the reaction of his father, especially when his initial sort of aim, his best case scenario was, well, I'll just be hired as a servant so that I can at least work on the land and not have to be in the terrible, even worse situation that I was in before. It's a step up, but it's certainly nowhere near where he was before.
Yeah. So he's gone from I know better than my father to I now know my place and my position. If you like.
Yes.
But the father doesn't treat him like that. He's openly compassionate.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think we're supposed to see the reaction of the father as somewhat surprising, as somewhat interesting and intriguing. This father who's so willing it would appear to allow this great loss to happen in the first place by giving this younger son of his all his inheritance far too early. The loss is incredibly great, and yet the reaction at his return is this incredible positive, incredible compassionate and generous one. So I think we're supposed to sort of see that and let that sort of marinate in our minds as we continue through the parable.
And again, as a hero, you put yourself into the shoes of the father.
Right.
Think,
yes.
Oh, okay. How would I react in this? And as you say, it's surprising because many would say, well, you're no son of mine. It's the phrase you use. And
exactly.
The natural reaction.
The younger son had his chance. The father had given him plenty of rope, if you like, and such a great loss has become of it. Yes. The father would well have perhaps been within his rights as a still living and still in control father, a man of his household and his estate, to rebuff the return have his son.
So you might think that's where it finishes.
Exactly.
With the party.
You could put a full stop at the end there and say, okay, we've learned a lesson.
Yeah.
But there is this third act, this incredibly interesting third act with the older brother that we'll read now.
Okay, so this is from verse 25. Now, his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound." But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found."
Now you have a professional here speaking to you. I am a older brother of a younger brother, and for those of you out there who are in a similar position to me, you will of course recognize yourself and your sibling, perhaps, in the attitude here of the older brother. This unwillingness to allow the joy of the parent to be expended over this brother who you think you know so well is so telling and is so challenging to me when I read this again and again and again, because it hits home so powerfully. The older brother sees and hears at a distance. He is coming towards the house and refuses even to enter. People have to come out to him. And he wants to do things on his terms. He also hints at the fact that he also wanted to sort of take some of his inheritance, this goat, and so that he can go away and celebrate with his friends. Both sons want to leave with something that the father owns, their inheritance, or at least something valuable that the father could give them, and go away and celebrate on their own and do things outside of the house of the father. So there's an interesting parallel there, that they're actually quite similar in some ways. But the father also has to come outside the house in order to try and coax him in, where you just imagine him sort of standing there, angry, arms crossed, adversarially, outraged at this sort of injustice of this younger son who has done all these terrible things, and he doesn't want any part of this celebration which he sees as wrong. He refers to him in verse 30, "But when this son of yours came," so you see, sort of distancing himself from his own brother here, and so the father, in his words, has to sort of try and correct that, verse 32, "For this your brother was dead." He's sort of trying to realign and bring them together again here. But here we see a wonderfully powerful, although wonderfully challenging picture for those older brothers of younger brothers out there amongst us, of dealing with of something that is peeking and attacking and poking at the pride of this older brother, who refuses to participate and wants to do things in some sense still on his own terms, and also looks at his own achievements and tries to sort of say, well, look at all the things that I have done. This is what he says in verse 29. "Look, these many years I have served you. I never disobeyed your command, yet you never did this, you never did that. Look, I've got a spotless record here. Look at all my achievements." Sort of runs through his little CV of the things that he has done, that he thinks sort of has accrued him all these positive points that he has never had the audacity to cash in, unlike this other son of yours. And so there is this disparity, and again we see the father doesn't react in a similarly proud way, in a similarly angry or refusing or combative way. Instead, he is going out to try and restore unity, to bring the older brother into the celebration. He's trying to align the two brothers back together so that they can all enjoy, in this instance, the fatted calf, the benefits of being in the house with the father, when initially both of them seem to want to leave the house and go off and do their separate things, thinking that they know best, rather than deferring to the father within the story.
Okay, so So there's a lot going on here, isn't there?
There is.
That to absorb, and so we've got two sons, and I think perhaps we're intended to contrast those. There's one who acts clearly pridefully, and you're kind of, no, don't do that, and it's a car crash. But he turns it round because he humbles himself. He realizes what he's really done and what he really is, and comes back to the father with that frame of mind. And then we've got the older son, who actually we're not told what he did.
We're not,
and whether he did go in. But there's another son there who perhaps hasn't had the same transformation of self-awareness as the younger son.
Exactly. I think we are to put ourselves in the shoes of each of these characters as we sort of work through these three acts. We can all think about times when we thought we knew best and we made a real hash of things, and we had to sort of go back cap in hand in some sort of scenario. That's the younger son. We thought about times where we were called perhaps to forgive someone who had wronged us or done something negative to us, and did we act like the father? Were we compassionate? Were we forgiving? And there's certainly times perhaps when we are like the older son, when we see someone who we would say has made a bunch of terrible decisions, caused a whole load of harm and loss, and this other group are too easily accepting of them and their return and their restoral to good graces. And as you say, yes, we have this sort of exquisite cliffhanger at the end of the parable. We don't know what the older brother is going to do. Is he going to join in and go and celebrate?
Which I guess sort of leaves the listeners in putting themselves in the shoes of these characters, going away, okay, what
exactly.
am I going to do?
Yes. What do you think is going to happen? What do I think is going to happen? That I think is part of what's going on here in the teaching. You're invited then to think, well, what is the response in the story going to be? But ultimately, what is my response going to be? Am I going to be affected by this when I find myself in this sort of situation?
That father figure, in both cases, the father goes out to when he saw the younger son a long way off, he went out and had compassion and so on. And he also went out of the house to the older son. Exactly. So he's reaching out. This father figure that we can see in the parable as God acting through Jesus is reaching out. But there are two different reactions, and it leaves. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. That's really helpful to think about that parable and that reaching out to I guess human beings that are naturally prideful, want to replace God. As that sort of fundamental issue that caused the breakdown in the relationship between God and human beings. This is a story. These are not real characters. So let's just finish by just a couple of examples of real people showing this kind of effect on them and their attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One that I think is great. We don't have to turn too far away from it. It's still in the Gospel of Luke, and it's Gospel of Luke chapter 7. We see someone here who recognizes the wonderful forgiveness that Jesus offers and their sort of reaction and place within it. And we also have some people here who are a bit like the older brother. From the parable we just looked at, so there is I think, a bit of parity here between the types of characters that we have. But it's the woman who is who's going to wash Jesus' feet. I'm sort of looking at Luke chapter 7 and verse 36 to the end is the description of this interaction here, and we see here this someone who is acting without any pride, with great humility and respect. And then we also have in the person of Simon, who owns the house in which this is all happening, acting much more like the older brother initially reacts, much more sort of prideful or aloof, and perhaps
who is this woman? She's a sinner.
Exactly. Yes.
Whereas I'm not.
Precisely. We have that sort of imbalance being drawn by Simon, and Jesus is going to correct that also in this section here.
Okay, so there's one example to and maybe it's worth if you want to take away and read that passage. It's from verse 36 of Luke 7 to the end. It's useful. So washing of feet kind of reminds me of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Well, I think that's in John 13, isn't it?
John 13, and again there we see that Jesus is going to do something that is challenging the perhaps the preconceptions or the notions of the teacher sort of student relationship when he goes and he washes the feet of his followers. This is John chapter 13. I'll read a very short section just so you know what's going on. At the end of verse chapter 2, it says, "And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him." And then, as he is going around and doing this thing, which was incredibly unusual for a teacher to do to his disciples, it was absolutely the other way around, is what you would normally expect. And that is what Simon Peter says to him in verse 6, is sort of incredulous Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" The idea being that Simon would be very readily willing, perhaps, to wash Jesus' feet. But this is an inversion of the way things should be done. And don't you? And because of this inversion is playing, I think, on this idea of authority and power and taking pride, and how that all sort of plays into that. Jesus is demonstrating here a very different kind of leadership. He is wielding the power that he has, the authority that he has, and is using it in this challenging and incredibly interesting and thought-provoking way. He is washing the feet of those around him. He isn't causing harm. He isn't dictating. He isn't ordering everybody about. He's the things that perhaps some leaders might well think, well, I'm well within my rights to do this and to do that, but that isn't the approach that he takes here.
Which is actually incredibly powerful as an act of leadership in the effect that it has on his disciples.
Absolutely. Yeah. So different from what we from some of those examples that we thought of before. The idea of self coming first, and in thinking about Kanye or Trump, sort of clothing themselves in gold in some sort of sense, either building a gigantic tower, a golden tower with your name on top of it, or wearing expensive clothing, all these sorts of things that are trying to demonstrate your power and your position, your authority, your place, your status. Instead here we see Jesus, the Lord and the teacher, washing the feet of his disciples, demonstrating a very different kind of leadership.
And as is often the case, as we kind of run out of time and draw to a close, we come to Jesus and land at Jesus with the answer to overcoming pride. So I mean, maybe just to kind of summarize what we've covered. We've thought about pride as this kind of detached from reality, overestimation, self-pride, particularly of our own abilities. That when we look at it biblically, is a deep-rooted problem that rears its head right at the beginning with the account of Adam and Eve, and that the sort of teaching of Jesus addresses the issue through stories like the prodigal son, powerful stories where you really put yourself into the position of the characters and think deeply about your own position and how God through Jesus is reaching out. And maybe we can just close with a few verses from Philippians chapter 2, which sort of brings a few of these things together. Philippians 2 and verses 4 to 6 or something like that. So, which says this: "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, he humbled himself to become obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross." Then it goes on to talk about his exaltation. So, unlike Adam and Eve, as we saw, who wanted to become God themselves, they wanted to be like God. Here's Jesus, and he's the opposite of that, not wanting to grasp at equality with God, and so becomes this template of how to overcome pride.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I think the leadership that Jesus demonstrates points us to doing things differently. Points us to the fact that this endless focus on ourselves or on self is unhealthy and causes this mismatch, this imbalance and so therefore, keeping these things in mind, if we are challenged when we find ourselves in a position of decision making or authority or power, to not bring pride into what we do there. And things like the parables, the parable of the prodigal son, for example, is a helpful and a powerful way to focus, to reframe our thoughts, and to consider his great teaching and his great example can, I think, help us when we find ourselves in these types of situations.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Josh, for leading us through that. I think that's we've covered a fair bit, and I hope it's been useful and interesting. And so, until next time, goodbye and God bless.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions or subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.